The last hem finish sample we'll look at goes by many names. I'm using the hem finish pattern. It's the last piece of muslin that's cut from this pattern. And this hem finish can be called the turned and stitched hem finish, the top stitched hem finish, or the dungaree hem finish. It goes by many names, but it's all the same hem. While some folks will think that this hem finish is really quick and easy because it is machine sewn, in fact, it doesn't take any more or any less time than any of the other hem finishes that we've been practicing. Because to do it properly and to get a clean finished edge that doesn't buckle or skew while top stitching, you have to employ some hand stitching as well. Just as we did with the previous hem finish, I'm going to use my ruler to measure a 1/4 inch up from this cut edge. Again, that's 2 little squares up from that cut edge. Make sure you're marking along this edge where you've made your internal line and your notches. And just as I did with the last sample, I'm going to fold along that line and finger press this into place. Now with this medium weight muslin, it folds very well. It folds almost like paper, so we'll take a fold quite well and hold it. But if you're working with other types of fabric, you might find that it doesn't want to hold that fold, and this is where you would pin this in place. If you were working on a skirt or a pair of pants, you would pin this in place, press this on your ironing board. So if you were working on pants or a skirt, you would fold up this 1/4 inch all the way around your hem. You'd pin it in place, take it to your ironing board, press it as well as you could, and then you would take your needle and thread and run a basting stitch all the way through this. The same stitch that we used on the hand sewing sample, just up and down, up and down, up and down. You would baste this in place to hold it in place to keep it from coming loose. I'm actually going to go ahead and press this on my ironing board, and I'll be right back. Couple of blasts of steam on my ironing board. I still have it pinned. I just place my iron across this and get some hits of steam. I'm going to go ahead and put a knot in my thread. I'm just using a single length of thread, and I'm going to hand baste this in place to ensure it doesn't slip out of place. Now, when you're doing these hand-basted stitches on this particular hem, what's important to note is which direction you're sewing. If I place my needle, I've folded this up. You can see there it is, it's folded up. So this would be the wrong side of my garment. If I place my needle down into my fabric to take my first stitch, and I pull this thread through, I'm going to have my knot seated right here on the wrong side of my garment. This is only the first step to the turned and stitched hem. You then have to turn this up the remaining 1 inch of the hem allowance, just like we did on the uneven slip stitch. And now my knot is going to get caught inside of my hem finish. Once I stitch this down on the machine, my knot is now caught underneath here. And chances are I'm not going to be able to take this out. I can clip the thread really closely, but that knot is going to get caught inside of my hem. So instead, I'm going to rethread my needle. And instead of placing my needle down from top to bottom from the wrong side to the right side, I'm going to place my needle up from the right side of my garment. Again, this would be the inside of my garment where the hem gets folded up. This would be the right side of my garment. So I'm instead going to bring my needle up through here, right in the middle of this 1/4 inch fold. And then I'll just do a quick running stitch up and down, running my needle all the way through, removing my pins as I go. Basting stitches are much more secure than pins, and it ensures that your fabric won't shift around as you're sewing it on the machine. These don't have to look pretty. They should be about 3/8 of an inch wide. Each of the stitches should be about 3/8 of an inch wide, maybe a 1/2 inch wide. Any wider than that, and the basting stitches don't really serve any purpose. If they're too wide, they're going to be too loose and they won't hold anything in place. And I'll take another little stitch here. Now when you're doing a basting stitch, when we did our hand stitches or hand sewing samples, we took tiny little knots over here. These are tight little knots that are not likely to come out. But when you're doing a basting stitch, you're using this running stitch as a basting stitch as a replacement for your pins. You don't have to take a tiny knot. We want to be able to remove these later. So I'm going to take a rather large stitch here, about 1/8 of an inch in and out of the fabric, going through all the layers. But rather than take a tiny little stitch and then place my needle through the loop of thread, I'm just going to take about 1/8 of an inch stitch and just pull my thread through. I'm not going to place a knot or anything like that, just enough to kind of anchor my thread, and I'll leave a little bit of a tail so that if I'm working on an actual garment, once I turn this hem allowance up and top stitch it in place, I can then remove my knot and just pull these stitches all the way out. For these samples, however, leave your basting stitches in place. I'm going to change my thread just so for demonstration purposes. You can keep the same color of thread on your needle, but we're going to hand stitch again before we even get to the machine. Okay, so we've got the first part of our hem finish turned, pressed, and basted in place. Now just as we did on the uneven slip stitch, we're going to turn this one more time. And using my notches, I'm going to use those to help me give me a guide for where my hem should fold. And if you're unsure, again, we had 1.25 inch hem allowance. We turned up 1/4 inch, and we should have 1 inch left. So it should be 1 inch all the way across, nice and uniform. Again, if you're working on an actual garment, you would pin this and press it into place. I'm going to go and press this, be right back. So that's pinned, that's pressed. Now you're probably asking, well, why didn't we do all this for the uneven slip stitch? You could. You absolutely could. The uneven slip stitch is a little more forgiving than the machine top stitch or dungaree hem. When you get into the machine top stitching and we get onto the machine, you may find, especially if you're working with some looser fabrics, as you start sewing, if you do not baste it in place with these hand basting stitches, you may find that your hem allowance starts to shift. The machine keeps, you know, if I'm sewing on my sewing machine in this direction, I've got my presser foot here, the presser foot and the machine is going to start kind of feeding the fabric through, and you may find that this hem allowance starts to shift. And before you know it, it starts to bunch on itself, and then it's uneven when it gets to the bottom. It can do one of these numbers where it starts to shift in one direction, and it gets too long in one section. I've got a little bit of an overhang here, and it makes for an uneven hem allowance. I would highly advise you to practice with some fabrics, working in the round with doing a dungaree top stitch, because you will find that it's very prone to shifting your fabric. So we've got to lock this fabric in place using our hand stitches. So I've turned under the remaining 1 inch, and again I'm going to hand baste this in place. I'm going to go through all of the layers and hand baste this in place. Just as we did before, I'm going to keep my knots in the same place, so I can already see where this original knot was. So I'm going to go through all of my layers in the same direction. Another reason why I'm using a different color of thread, so I can see what I'm doing. I've just pushed my needle through from this side to this side. And again, I'm going to take my running stitches up and down, up and down. Send that thread on through. Make sure that I'm smoothing my work out as I go. So there are my 2 little knots, and here are my stitches coming through to the front side, and I will just continue all the way across. When we're doing the uneven slip stitch, you would still press and pin your fabric, and you could hand stitch it in place to hold it. But because you're using hand stitches, you have a little bit more freedom to be able to shift your hem allowance to where it needs to be, and it avoids that shifting that can happen when you're working on the sewing machine. Because once you start on the sewing machine, you just gotta let the machine do its job. And sometimes when you're working with this kind of hem finish on slippery fabrics, it can cause problems. And again, just to anchor my thread, I'm just going to take like a 1/4 inch stitch in and out through all the layers. There's my needle. Pull that through. Leave some tails. Leave a little bit of tail there. So now I've got 2 lines of basting stitches. One in red, that was my original, to lock down my 1/4 inch fold, and then one in gray to lock everything down into place. There is the right side of my fabric, so you can see those basting stitches coming through. I'm going to hit this one more time with the iron. I've got some dents in my fabric from my pins, so I'm going to hit it with the iron, and then I'll go to the sewing machine to finish this up. So here at my sewing machine, just as we did with the turned and stitched, I'm now going to top stitch through all of my layers, and I'm going to place this folded edge along the inner edge of this rightmost toe. So I'm going to line it up right along there, lifting my presser foot, placing my work in, and again you can see this fold is lined up along this edge of my rightmost toe. Lowering my needle, make sure I get that into my work. 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back. And stitch straight on through. Walk my last few stitches, 2 stitches back, 2 stitches forward, get my back tack in there. Make sure my take-up lever is all the way up, raise my foot, remove my work, snip my threads. So there is our top stitched edge. That's what the stitches look like from the right side. let's head back to the work table. So here is our turned and stitched hem sample with our top stitching at the bottom. This would be the wrong side of the garment, and the right side of the garment, some white stitches there. My bobbin thread is white. Now I want you to leave the original line of stitching where you left your basting stitches for that 1/4 inch turn back. I want to make sure that you are doing that hand stitching because this is important when you're doing the machine top stitched seam. But my gray threads here, my second line of stitching that I used to hold down this 1 inch segment, we can remove that so we don't see it from this side. I'm going to go ahead and snip through those threads, start pulling those out so I know which threads I'm pulling. I'm going to pull out my knot. So if you're using the same colored thread, start removing them from this side and you'll see which ones are coming out over here. Go ahead and pull these out. Take out those tiny little stitches, remove all those threads. If you wish, you can press it one more time. If you're going to press it from the right side of the garment. Sometimes pressing from the wrong side can push a little bit of a fold, a little bit of a divot. This folded edge can sometimes push down and create a bit of a ridge on the front of your garment. I'm going to label this. And that completes our turned and stitched, machine top stitched, or dungaree hem finish.